So, any chance you're looking for like a cool new gig? I mean, like a super cool new gig? You ever thought about becoming a nightmare? I don't mean like a nightmare like you're somebody's horror. I mean a mayor of the night economy, an ambassador for 24-hour culture, an advocate for what happens between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. I stumbled upon this through a colleague of mine at the CBC that mentioned that the City of Toronto is about to appoint or hire its first ever night mayor. Now, technically, the job title is something around the lines of manager of the night economy. But, quite frankly, the nickname Nightmare is kind of cooler, and I'm sort of imagining what sort of mayoral accoutrements will you get that'll go around you. Will you have a gavel? I've got a gavel right here. Will you be holding a council together and actually having a nightmare council session? What really the City of Toronto is looking for is more of a changemaker. Somebody who's going to look beyond the clubs and just partying and boozing it up and really looking at the entire night economy. Businesses, culture, services. So the want ad might be something more like culture shifting, business boosting, safety advocating, community building, leadership role that can really help redefine the appearance of the 416 or the 6 or the 905 or whatever you want to call it after dark. Pretty sure that every English teacher I've ever had, is that the right grammar, would be really offended by my culture busting, community building, hyphen sentence, but we'll park that for a second. This idea of a nightmare might sound new to people who live in Toronto, where I live, or even in a Canadian context. But you know what? It's not new. It's something that's been happening globally, quite frankly, for over a decade. And maybe you should ask yourself the same question. Does your city have a nightmare, or somebody whose job it is to advocate for the economy, for culture, from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m.? It's something I didn't even think about, I didn't know, and quite frankly, it's got me pretty excited. Now, not surprisingly, this entire concept of a nightmare started over 10 years ago in Amsterdam. Merrick Milan was literally appointed as the first night mayor, and his whole idea was, how do you open things up? It's not about shutting things down. It's not about curbing noise. Well, obviously you want to think about things like noise, but it's about how do you create a city, a community that functions as well in the middle of the night as it does in the middle of the day. And yes, Amsterdam introduced some specific things like 24-hour venue licenses, but they also worked on really important media matters. For example, they streamlined mediation between local residents and nightlife operators. This is obviously one of those situations where, depending on what side of the equation you're on, you could imagine that if you're pro nightlife, you sort of think of neighbors and residents as being that one person, or maybe those two people that constantly complain about the noise. Perhaps you might go so far as to suggest that they're the people that were left out, so they're not as happy as some of the others. But how do you create that middle point where you've got an opportunity to hear fairly both sides of the equation and think about solutions? One of the biggest challenges, and I know it exists here in Toronto, is looking at, especially now, office buildings and workspaces that aren't as utilized as they used to be, especially pre-pandemic. I mean, they're still here, they're still fully functioning, but they're not full. They're not being utilized. They're not being operationalized. And so how do you then reimagine licensing for those buildings? How do you reimagine what the permitting is for those buildings? How do you reimagine being able to use them, like what I did with my light there, for cultural hubs? And so under Milan leadership, he didn't work at protecting the club scene what he did was look at how did he professionalize it, how did he help educate the city, see it as a strategic asset, and then, not seeing it anymore necessarily as a nuisance. And his work has been so vetted that they actually had the opportunity to create a Nightmare Summit where they gathered global leaders, urban leaders from around the world to talk about nighttime development, nighttime governance, and how do you look at that culture. About 6 months ago, Dublin followed suit. They went out and hired a gentleman who used to be the director of a music festival called Sea Sessions. His name is Ray O'Donoghue, and his official title is Nighttime Economy Advisor. And, he's really focused on some key fundamental principles: safety, transport, mobility, culture activity. And you've got to look at things like, hey, if you're going to ask or invite people or encourage people to be out later, you obviously need to tackle safety, both practically and the perception of safety. So one of the things that he looked at was, implementing security guards on Dublin bus services, creating safe waiting zones for that same public transportation, and just an overall expansion of 24-hour bus routes. The ability and access to low-cost transit, reliable and safe transit throughout the night is one of the biggest issues that you hear when you survey what's going on with night economy advocates, nightmares around the country. But one of the other big things is to get away from this, sort of perception that all this effort is about booze and partying and clubs and pickup joints, if you will, but with more of a functional focus, I would say, on things like cultural events. One of the things that O'Donoghue brought in was this concept or this idea of the Nocturnal Beats music trail, which allowed for a multiple venue event to showcase offerings in Dublin's culture and have it run to like 2:30 in the morning. I think this is, the type of effort that you're seeing. Raheem Manning is the Nightmare in Philadelphia. And Raheem has a very specific economic development lens to his work. He wants to make sure that the nightlife in Philadelphia is more inclusive, looking at key groups, starting with the LGBTQ2+ community, also looking at folks from underestimated communities, Black entrepreneurs, different types of artists, folks from the different pop communities, although I personally don't love that term, event producers, and really how do you create pathways, if you will, for small business owners to more easily access and afford late night permits, garner more support for their efforts. Another key strategy that Manning's implemented, which I personally like and I think is quite shrewd, is recognizing that in places like Philadelphia, you have so many different communities, and how do you empower them to not be pushed to the sidelines after dark, but to be fully involved, to be fully engaged. In fact, the research has shown from the communities that have embraced more night economies is that when you recognize that this should not be clustered, that it should not just be put in one location, that you actually create something that's more safe, that's more viable, that's more long-term. And I'll give you a little simple example. If everything is clustered in one little area, in one little community, then whenever those events end, everybody's in the same spot, which often can raise tensions, whether it be as simple as trying to get a taxi or a ride share or a bus or a subway or a tram or whatever, to people bumping into each other, to all of a sudden a crush on street or local food and noise. But if you actually disperse it out to communities, then you're taking that same number of people, diluting the concentration, reducing risk, reducing noise, reducing an overly burden on services. Because quite frankly, one of the hardest things to plan in any service is like the peaks and valleys, right? It's much easier to plan for a service to support whatever offering you're providing on a consistent basis. Over here in Canada, we long make fun of Ottawa being, not the most fun city. I think it's There's some slang about Ottawa being the city that fun left behind. And when they decided to find a night commissioner, they actually looked to Montreal, to a gentleman by the name of Mathieu Grondin, who had founded an organization in Montreal called MTL 2424. And that was all about, he was seeing how club scenes and bars were being harassed and shut down or pushed bureaucratically because of the complaints of one or two people. And his point of view was, he appreciates that the city is trying to support and respect the wishes of its constituents, but you're kind of sort of following the lead or the direction or the input of kind of the one or two people that want to complain. Yet you have this whole mass of people that are looking for outlets and opportunity. And so he's really, in his role in Ottawa, he's got this interesting balancing act to deal with between cultural vibrancy and urban planning. So how do you take a city like Ottawa that's quite office heavy downtown? The core is, built for workers, for government employees, for businesses, and how do you balance that with events and pop-ups and performances at night? And as well, looking further, much like O'Donoghue is in Ireland, in terms of safety, better integration of public transit service, more support for after-hours events. Venezuela, which is a country where, you might not think about this being something you'd expect to see, there's all sorts of community leaders and cultural organizations in Caracas who are doing what you might call more informal nightmare initiatives. And their attempt is to reclaim public spaces with a focus on things like markets, late night storytelling, music. And these things are really grassroots, super hype or local. But what this really demonstrates to me is when you do that sort of thing is you really get to foster that cultural identity, and it helps build community resilience. I think that's one of the most important things about communities. When people like each other, when people are helping each other prosper and succeed, you build resilience within a community. You build that safeguard that people are looking out for each other. And that's one of the things that they're seeing in Venezuela as one of the outputs of the informal nightmare work that's being done there. All these leaders have something in common. They all understand that the night economy is not just about clubs and concerts. It's about jobs. It's about safety. It's about creativity. It's about inclusion. It's about transformation. Because every city in the world has people who work 24 hours. The other day in Toronto, I was walking by a place called Sleepless Studios in Niagara, and I actually had to look it up. What is the Sleepless Studio? And it's a place for artisans and podcasters and creators to go who want to be there 24 hours a day. Now, I think there's, as a sponsorship market, there's a real opportunity here that perhaps sponsorship could play a bigger role in the plans that municipalities have, the plans to unlock the full potential at night. There are communities that have things like nighttime advocacy maps. Well, those maps could have a complete integration, stealing from the folks at Waze here for a minute, who do a really good job of, place-based marketing. But how could you take these different tools and think about the events that are happening, music tours, late night sports leagues, business conferences where you have people from other countries and cities that might want to do things after the hotel lobby bar closes, and provide opportunities for brands and corporations and services to partner with them. I don't want to see a bunch of logos all over the place. I'm sure the drone show providers out there are all having great ideas. And by the way, that's probably not a bad angle. Maybe I should have kept that. Maybe I should have kept that one for myself. But there's a real opportunity to take over the night. And take it over not just from a B2C standpoint, but from a B2B standpoint. Thinking about those small micro entrepreneurs that are fledgling. What a great opportunity for people in the financial sector, people trying to, organizations that are trying to grow business with that person who might have only had personal banking before, now is needing some support, fintech, you name it. Obviously, the safety side of things brings a huge opportunity for technology companies and apps with very specific tools designed for night settings, safety, mobility. Think about access. Access is not great in many cities at the best of times. It's probably much worse for those who have different physical abilities from 10 p.m. to 4, 5, 6 a.m. than it is during the day. From a telecommunications standpoint, there's obviously great opportunities. And I think the nice thing about the night economy is, the more things you create live and in person, the more things that you also will create virtually. And then I even think about like insurance companies who can work on things like safety for venue operators and staff. These are all things that are going to build relevance for brands, they're going to build equity for brands, and they're also going to be, I think, supporting the infrastructure for the city as well. It's pretty obvious that there's a massive opportunity for event-based sponsorships that are tied to the night. You can imagine these large-scale cultural events, but I do want to sort of think, the power of some of that hyper-local stuff we were talking about from Venezuela. City-sanctioned late-night markets, rooftop cinemas where maybe the view isn't going to bother anybody, and maybe people are all wearing headphones, so it's kind of like the silent disco meets drive-in movie, if you will. Street food programs. You think about the night markets that exist in Asia. Why can't we have that sort of thing here, and all night art crawls where people are experiencing art not just once a year. There's a real challenge to correct policy so that office towers around the world can host events, whether it be on unused floors or, quite frankly, I look at my own office and you can't see it from here, but we have a ton of equipment and layouts and things that could be utilized for events. So why can't downtown office buildings become art galleries at night? Why can't city parks become safe, curated, nighttime destinations where you don't have to worry about the flickering light bulb? I think there's a real opportunity here in that sponsorship area. So let's go back to the top. Do you want to be Toronto's new nightmare? Or maybe you're happy doing what you're doing, driving your brand forward, building your business. But I think there's an opportunity whether you want the job or you like the notion of what the job's trying to achieve, where you can lean in with your corporation, with your brand, with your resources, with your dollars, with your know-how, your infrastructure, your employee base, your reach, your supplier relationships, and not just become an investor, but become an advocate. Become somebody who wants to be something bigger than just a campaign. And I think the cities that act now, the brands that act now, that integrate sponsorship into the DNA of the night economy that they're going to create, they're going to be the ones that shine the brightest, even when it's dark. So let's think about it this way. Let's stop seeing the night as the end of the day, and let's start seeing the night as the start of a new day. I'm Mark Harrison. Looking forward to your feedback.